Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, Katie Godden, and the team at The Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, so we wanted to do something slightly different. This week, we're talking about carbon footprinting and learning. I'm delighted to welcome Nicky Sinker to the podcast. Thank you for joining me, Nicky. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, thank you so much, Katie. Lovely to be here. And yeah, just a quick bit of background on me, I guess. So I grew up internationally before becoming a financial accountant. I then moved into business management, COO roles, first in banking and then in law firms. Increasingly was getting involved in sustainability and saw a bit of a market gap, really, where, in sustainability, there were two categories of kind of organizations that could help you. So there was one that were consultants who could help you strategically. And then there were another category, which were people who could give you tools to calculate your footprint. But actually, a lot of those tools weren't accurately calculating your footprint using things like spend-based data, etc. So retrained as a carbon accountant. And really what that meant was that I could bring my financial accounting background to help people measure their carbon footprint, and my COO background to help with the reduction of your carbon footprint. So to help to pull together actionable plans to reduce your carbon footprint and to really drive behavioural change around carbon management.
That sounds really interesting. I know that you've obviously gone from a financial accountant to a carbon one. Do people make that change quite often? Is that a common thing to happen at all? Not necessarily from finance, but are people moving careers to go into that space?
Yeah, it's interesting because actually, a couple of years ago, no one would know what a carbon accountant is. But now, when I go along and I meet fellow accountants, it's definitely an area that more and more people want to move into. I think that, actually the younger generation in particular, they really want to work with organizations who are doing the right thing by the environment. And they see this as a really interesting career choice because it is, yes, using technical experience in terms of your accounting background, but doing it in a way that's really helping drive good environmental perspective, but actually also from a business perspective, because, actually businesses should be calculating their carbon footprint and reducing their carbon. It puts them in a position to win more work, it puts them in a position to attract and retain talent, and it also helps them reduce their costs. So yeah, I think it is an increasingly popular career choice.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting. Could you explain a little bit more about your consulting work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work mainly with SMEs. So I help them to calculate their carbon footprint. So identify all the emissions from that business and quantify what those emissions are. We then set science-based targets for their net zero journey. We then put in place implementable carbon reduction plans. And carbon reduction covers behavioural change, it covers procurement projects, and it also covers capital projects. I work for Auditel, and we bring together our carbon and our cost expertise to help companies reduce their carbon, but also their costs. And I often say that the most carbon efficient business is just a very efficient business. We do also support with a lot of education around climate change, carbon management, etc. So explaining to companies or to individuals the terminology in this space, why it's so important for businesses to manage their carbon, how to manage your carbon, and what the different regulations are in this space as well.
You've alluded to the importance of obviously companies understanding more about carbon emissions and why it's important to them. But why is that important?
So if you want to have a sustainable, growing business, you need to be mindful of your environmental impact. Managing your carbon, as I said, it means you are in a position to win more work, but also talent. And the earlier you start, the more you can differentiate yourself versus your competitors. You can also be prepared to meet regulatory requirements, which are increasingly impacting businesses of all sizes. The EU recently put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that impacts any organisation importing certain products into the EU. The NHS now requires any business supplying them to have a carbon reduction plan for which you need to have calculated your carbon footprint. So, really increasingly, in order to win work and to stay in business, you need to have calculated your carbon footprint and have carbon reduction plans in place. But I also talked about those sort of business efficiencies. Those carbon reduction plans identify things that you can do more efficiently, and that therefore also improves your profitability. All businesses will eventually have to go on a carbon reduction journey. So it's really, I think, a missed opportunity if you don't get started early, because if you start now, you'll get all those benefits. But if you leave it to the last minute, you're increasing the risk to your business and also the environment, but you're probably also increasing the costs.
Why do you think the younger generation care about it a bit more? Because obviously I understand they're growing up and people are more aware of it nowadays, and there's more conversations happening about this. So I guess they've got access to that information where previous generations might not, but they seem to be more enthusiastic, more interested in it, and it's more important to them. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're absolutely right in terms of they are more aware. When I was at school, we didn't learn anything about this really. Whereas I know I've got young children, they're in school, they have lessons on this. Universities, I get approached by lecturers about, what universities are educating people on this well. It's really a focus of a lot of the educational organisations on really making people aware of what is happening in relation to climate and the impact that has, and therefore what they can be doing differently. I've got a 10-year-old daughter who decided to give up red meat, for example, because she wanted to reduce her impact on the environment, because she was aware of some of the individual choices that she can make. So I think, one, it is much bigger awareness. But I think, two, unfortunately, we are obviously beginning to see the impact of climate change. In the UK, we maybe see it less than elsewhere, but we have definitely seen increased flooding, for example, is a very, real example of the impact of climate change in this country. And I think, obviously, younger people have seen this throughout their life. They're seeing it reported in the news, they're learning about it at school, and they are feeling the impact, and therefore they really understand that if they want to have, unfortunately, an environment that they can live in comfortably throughout their life, we do need to be making change. There is also, unfortunately, the fact that people do not necessarily find change easy, and that's where I think you've got this sort of difference between a lot of the older generation, which unfortunately I am probably in, and the younger generation. Because, although I've made a career out of change, I used to be a COO, I drive change, that's what I do. And I think that's why I mentioned that I grew up internationally. I was used to a high level of change. I used to move around a lot. I used to have to adapt to different languages and cultures and etc. So my whole life has been about change, but I'm very conscious that that's not the same for everybody. And a lot of the organizations that I work for, sometimes it's really difficult. The more senior people, it's like, well, I can understand why this would be important for the organization and we'll do it because we know we have to. But actually, I'm still want to jump on a plane. I still want to print everything, etc. What difference am I really going to make? But I think, that understanding that I think a lot of the younger generation have, that, ultimately, I want to do whatever I can to have an impact, because if all of us don't take a level of responsibility and take action, we're never going to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of reaching net zero.
So when you're going into businesses and helping with training, etc., and you've got different generations, so you've got kind of older generation and a new generation coming in, and that those different levels of awareness and understanding about carbon emission and their impact on that, how can you easily incorporate that into businesses so everyone's getting the same benefits and understanding as well from it?
Yeah, I mean, we always start off with a sort of a general awareness session. So bringing everyone to the same base level of understanding. And some of that is just, around explaining what are greenhouse gases, for example, where in a business are emissions actually occurring. So really bringing people up to that base level understanding, explaining the terminology, explaining what we are seeing in terms of how organizations are driving climate change, why it's so important for organizations to measure their carbon footprint and reduce their carbon footprint, and how they go about that process. That general awareness tends to happen with everyone in the organization initially, and then a lot of people then build that into their onboarding program over time as well, so that everyone coming into the organization has that base level of awareness. And then we have initiatives that go on throughout the year. So, for example, how do you recycle things properly? It's amazing how often you go into an office and there's 4 different bin options, and you look at the bin options and there's stickers there, and you're like, I just still don't quite know where to put my tea bag. Which bin is it? So
Yeah.
actually, some of it is around really clearly labeling what people should be doing. Because actually, if you think about the things that people are going to be commonly disposing of, put a sticker on the bin that shows that that is the bin that they should put that into, but also have that kind of ongoing engagement around how you recycle, all the things that you've got as an organization that are available, so things like cycle to work schemes. So we very much build in kind of one set piece training, but then ongoing communication initiatives throughout the year. We then do more in-depth training where it is also relevant. So, for example, you've got training around specific bits of regulation that might be relevant to, compliance teams, for example. Or you have more in-depth training that we do around, things like how do you actually calculate a carbon footprint, which we might do to, groups of accountants, for example, who want to be supporting clients on this going forward. So you've got general sessions to raise awareness. You've then got sort of communication happening throughout the year, making sure that that communication also feeds into the general communication of the organization. I was just speaking to a CEO just earlier, and I was saying, look, actually, when you give your quarterly updates, you need to make sure you're referencing this, so that everyone in the organization can understand that it's really important, and you're really focusing on, the couple of things that we have in terms of priority. And prioritization is really important in this space. I've gone to, a few organizations where they're doing 1,000 initiatives, but each of those 1,000 initiatives are maybe not being done very well, or actually have a really small overarching impact. A lot of the time, what we do is really calculate the footprint, which highlights your emissions hotspots, and then we work on a carbon reduction plan and really prioritize the reduction activities that are going to have the most significant impact, so that you might be doing 3 initiatives, but doing them really well and focusing on the ones that are going to make the most significant impact to your footprint. And then you can move on to the next lot of initiatives.
So I'm guessing from what you've just said as well, data is a big part of this, right? Because you need to understand where those hotspots are, etc. How are you calculating those?
Yeah, I mean, data is absolutely really key. And I was literally just on the phone to a prospective client around the data gathering. So some information is very easily accessible. So you have what we call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which are generally much more easy to measure and to manage. So scope 1 is basically the burning of fossil fuels in your company facilities or in your company vehicles. So it tends to be your gas that you're using for heating. So the data is coming through in your gas bill. It is your refrigerants and things like your air conditioning. So you're getting the information for that on your air conditioning servicing records. And it is the fuel that you're using in your company vehicles. So that tends to be fairly easy to measure. Scope 2 is then a form of plumbed electricity, as plumbed energy coming into your organization, where the burning of fossil fuels is happening upstream. So that is your electricity usage. And again, you get most of the information you need for that on your electricity bill. It's scope 3, which is effectively all the other emission sources, which is much more complicated in terms of gathering the data that you need in order to measure and to manage it. So scope 3 breaks down into 15 different subcategories. And some of the main ones are waste from operations, which is getting easier to calculate because a lot of the waste operators are now very used to people asking for the information, but you've got to get, weights and disposal methods of any recycling, general waste, hygiene waste, water, and so get all of that information so we can do the calculation. So that's one category is waste. You've got another category, which is employee commuting, which includes home working. And the data we need for that tends to come through an employee survey. You've then got transportation and distribution of goods and services into an organisation and out of an organisation. And that is one of the most complex aspects of your carbon footprint to calculate, because it effectively means engaging with your supply chain to obtain all the information around all the deliveries coming into and out of the organisation. So that is one of the most complex elements. And then one of the other complex pieces and another main category is business travel. It sounds like it wouldn't be as complicated as it often is, but a lot of the time it's around the information that people actually gather as part of their normal process. Because again, on business travel, what you need is where people are traveling to and from and the type of vehicle that they are traveling in and the type of fuel that's being used for that vehicle. So those are some of the main categories that just give you a sense of the fact that scope 3 is much more difficult in terms of obtaining the data that you need and then calculating the emissions in relation to that.
Yeah, it must be a huge task, especially when you look into kind of the supply chain bit of it as well. And I think people don't even think about that. They probably just see it as recycling to a degree. Is there any particular industry that's particularly difficult to kind of reduce these? So I was just thinking as you were speaking, things like hospitality, for example, when you're working in bars or restaurants and things. So they've got air conditioning running, they've got electricity running, they've got fridges, etc., etc. Are they more difficult to reduce because you need to have those things on than perhaps an office where you could change the way that you've got lighting, etc.?
Yeah, it's interesting because, professional services companies that work in an office, yes, they can reduce their scope 1 and scope 2 really easily. And the thing that tends to be the most difficult for them is business travel, because actually, particularly if they rely a lot on aeroplane travel, there's obviously a lot of work happening in terms of investing in different new renewable fuels for airplanes, etc. But they're not on the market yet. So when people jump on a plane at the moment, it's going to be a high emission activity. So and then obviously engaging with their supply chain. But scope 1 and scope 2, they will reduce quite easily. However, for a professional services firm, 80% of their emissions generally will be in their scope 3. So in that harder to reduce category.
Right.
Whereas actually, when you go to some other industries, like perhaps manufacturing or even some hospitality, you might have a higher percentage in scope 1 and scope 2. And scope 1 and scope 2 tend to be easier to reduce, but it can cost money. So, for example, if you are a car leasing business, you can change all of your company vehicles to electric vehicles, which would reduce your scope 1 massively. But it's going to cost you quite a lot of money to transfer all of your fleet to being electric vehicles. So it's very different in every industry. I think, when you look at some of the manufacturing industry, actually, sometimes it's about having to completely redesign the process that you are currently doing in order to use less in that process. So there's a lot of innovation and there's a lot of R&D credits to fund some of that innovation in terms of building more environmentally friendly practices across different industries.
And I guess given the kind of changes in regulations and laws and things like that that are going to happen, and people are going to have to reduce their carbon emissions going forward, But if people aren't starting to do that now, what challenges are they going to face going forward if they're not providing this training, if they're not reducing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one, businesses are beginning to lose work if they're not reducing their carbon. And actually, it's amazing how often businesses come to work with me because that's happened. So, I had one of my clients who I engaged with last year, and at the time they said, look, we're not going to do anything differently in this space. We have someone who calculates our carbon footprint. We know it's not very good. We don't do anything with it. But someone on our board's close to this organization and we're just not going to change. But then in January, they lost 3 pitches in a row because of their ESG credentials and particularly their environmental credentials. And so they came to me obviously in January and said, we're losing work because we don't do this properly. And so now obviously I've calculated their carbon footprint and we are working together in terms of identifying reductions for that business. So businesses are very much facing, even now, the fact that they are not able to win work if they're not on their carbon management journey. And I spoke to another firm recently. He said, actually, we're really finding recruitment really, really, really difficult. And this is something we want to do to differentiate ourselves in order to be able to win talent. But I think going back to your question around sort of the training aspect, I talked about behavioural change being kind of one of the categories of carbon reduction. It's really the category that in a lot of ways can be the most impactful, because often in behavioural change, you're engaging with your employees, but you're also engaging with suppliers and potentially with clients as well. You can't reduce your carbon footprint without getting a number of people on board with the journey ultimately. So that change in terms of the training and engaging people in your carbon reduction journey is really, really important. So if you think back to what I was saying about scope 1, so scope 1 is your gas for heating and refrigerants for air conditioning. Well, that relies upon people not fiddling around with temperature controls, for example, to be as efficient as possible. And therefore, the training around the impact of fiddling with those controls is important. So people stop doing it, change the way that they used to work. Scope 2, if you think about electricity use, you're reliant upon people switching things off when they're not in use. So switching monitors off, switching lights off, maybe using the stairs rather than using the lift. I know my daughter's absolutely when you leave a room, you turn off the light, and we don't have any lights on in the house other than the room that we are in. It's those sort of changes that are going to make a difference. If you think to scope 3, I talked about employee commuting, actually people making the decision to cycle and walk if they can, rather than driving, etc. If you think to business travel, I know I spoke about air travel being difficult in terms of decarbonising totally. But one of the things people can do is think more carefully about, do I really need to take that trip? Can I achieve what I want to be achieving in another way without getting on that plane? I think one of the things we learned through COVID was, travel obviously fell off a cliff. A lot of organisations weren't travelling at all. And, I absolutely don't think that we should not travel anyway, from a business perspective or from a personal perspective. But you could definitely be more thoughtful about the most efficient and effective way of achieving what you want to achieve through business travel. So rather than 8 people from a firm going to see a client, actually, why isn't one of those or 2 of those go and see the client, and actually the rest of them are dialing in on the VC if they're bringing a technical piece of expertise, for example, or using a Eurostar makes a massive difference versus flying to Paris, and I way prefer the Eurostar personally. Anyway, because you can work much more easily on Eurostar than you can on a plane, and you have to be at the airport way in advance of when you have to be at Eurostar. You get more room on Eurostar, all these sort of things.
More relaxed.
Exactly. But it's all those sort of small things that people can do that ultimately you can educate them on through that sort of training and communication that leads to some of that behavioural change.
So I think obviously COVID was probably a catalyst to make some of those changes. Like you said, obviously travel kind of dropped off because we weren't allowed to leave the house. But as we're kind of coming out of this and it's been a couple of years now where everything's kind of gone back to normal, do you think where people are reintroducing, kind of forcing people to go into the office, or getting people to go back in kind of on set days and stuff like that, do you think that's necessarily required sometimes? Because we've kind of proved back in COVID that we could work from home. I get that there are benefits, etc., but having that level of flexibility to allow people to choose that and obviously help them reduce kind of things like carbon emission, do you think we should be thinking about that a little bit more now as well?
So it's interesting in terms of carbon emissions and working from home policies, because it is not always the case that working from home means lower emissions. So if you think about it, for example, if you are a London-based firm, everyone will be coming into the office generally on public transport, and that transport will run whether or not they use it, and you will be heating and cooling that office for everyone that's coming in, versus people staying at home and heating their building just for them. So it's not necessarily the case that it saves carbon emissions by people not coming into work. It does sometimes, depending on what your workforce looks like on the time of year. So often in winter, it's easier for everyone to go into the office and just to heat one building than to heat lots of different buildings. And people often heat their whole house rather than just heating the room that they are in. But as you sort of alluded to, and I definitely see, there's a huge benefit to flexible working where you can do it, both from a mental well-being perspective, etc., and also just from an organizational perspective, because I think it's made people have to think about what environment is right for the work that I need to be doing today. So actually, if I am a lawyer, for example, and I need to draft a document, actually, you know what, it might be better for me to stay at home today because I need that quiet space and I'm going to draft my document. But actually, if I don't necessarily have a piece of work that's going to take me 6 hours to sit down and do, and actually I might be doing a bit of a plan for how to approach something, it might be better for me to be in the office so I can collaborate with my colleagues and get their thoughts on my plan, or just have a discussion about, actually when someone else had a project that was like this, what do they do, etc. So from a carbon emissions perspective, it's not necessarily as black and white as people think, but I think ultimately flexibility where you can do it is really important. We do have to be mindful that it's not possible for every role. Facilities teams, for example, will have to be in the office in order to run the office. So it really does very much depend on the role and the organisation.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's probably my kind of naive way of looking at it as well, because you just assume that when you're kind of moving around, that's what's going to be causing the most amount of carbon emissions. But like you said, actually heating your house and stuff like that, if you're just heating one place, it makes a big difference rather than everyone heating their houses individually. So yeah, that's some training for me today as well. So Nicky, it's been great speaking to you, but what does your future look like going forward for your role and for you personally?
Well, it's interesting because I know, obviously you focus on learning, and I think having moved into this space, learning is an absolutely critical part of what I do. So I actually spend a day a week learning because this area is developing so fast. It's really important to keep up to date. And I love that because I've always personally been a keen learner anyway, but I will continue to do that. So I will continue to dedicate a lot of time to to learning and building up my knowledge base and keeping on top of all the developments in this space. I'm also obviously run my own business, so what my future very much is around continuing to build my business and continuing to build my profile in this space as well. So yeah, no, it's exciting, and I think ultimately what's fantastic about what I do is there's kind of three key aspects. So one is about sharing that learning with others to continue to raise other people's knowledge and awareness of why thinking about the environment is so important. The second piece is actually helping businesses be more successful, ultimately helping them win more work, win talent, and being more profitable. And then third aspect is obviously the great joy of also doing things that are hopefully having an environmental impact in a positive way as well. So yeah, that's what my future looks like.
That sounds awesome, and I think you're doing a really good job, like especially around carbon emissions. Like, you're saving the planet ultimately, or helping people to, and like you said, helping people move forward in their business, and individuals as well finding jobs as well. So I think that's great. So thank you so much for joining me today. If people want to connect with you, follow your journey, find out more about your business, how do they go about doing so?
So I am very present on LinkedIn, which is always a really good channel to engage with me. So it's Nicky Sinker Auditel on LinkedIn, and yeah, you'll find me on there. That also gives my contact details in terms of email, etc. If you want to get in touch with me as well. But I'm always really keen to hear from people who have an interest in this space. I collaborate a lot with lots of different people, whether it be going into schools and doing training, organizations, sharing of ideas, and obviously helping organizations to calculate and reduce their carbon footprint as well. But yeah, please do get in touch if you want to learn more.
Thank you very much. I'll put all of those links in the show notes below. Thank you once again for joining me today.
No, thank you so much, Katie. It's been fantastic to be involved, and hopefully, yeah, it was helpful to everyone.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the Learning Effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.